Hello and welcome everyone to another episode of Stand&Talk from the Jewish Stand. I am the founder and director, Shmuel von Weisl, and I am absolutely delighted to invite who I believe is a role model for young British Jews today, Phil Rosenberg. Phil is a former Labour councillor and current president of the Board of Deputies of British Jews. He is a prominent figure in the British Jewish leadership who made history by becoming the youngest ever president of the board when he was elected in 2024 at the age of 38. Phil has many years of experience in leading roles in the Jewish community, from community engagement to interfaith work. And to top it off for us, for the Jewish Stand, Phil is also our very first guest to the podcast who has not yet written an article for the Jewish Stand. So with that introduction, Phil, thank you so much for coming on. How are you and how is your family?
Thank you very much, Molin. It's an honor to be with you. Delighted to be with you today. And yeah, like every family in the Jewish community, we're very much looking forward to Shabbat. That's the first thing. But, we know that we as a community, as a people, are in challenging times. We're all of us in the shadow of the 7th October, of the ongoing hostage crisis, the ongoing war, and of course, the massive rise in anti-Semitism. So we're all very conscious of that. At the same time, there's so many good things happening in the UK Jewish community. It's a really great honor to have the role that I have and to see all of that. So, realistic about the challenges, but upbeat about the potential and the future of this community.
That's amazing. And I'm sure we're going to hear more about it later. So let's get right into it. And before we get into the more difficult questions, I would like to point out that although I'm interviewing you as a director of the Jewish Stand, I am also an under 35 observer in the Board of Deputies for the Leeds Jewish Representative Council. However, when I boast that to my friends, they often respond in one of two ways. What does that even mean? And sometimes worse is, what does the board even do? So, Phil, as a president of the board, could you explain to us what exactly the board does and also how you became its president?
Sure, of course. Well, the Board of Deputies is the national representative body of the UK Jewish community to government, media, different faith communities, and the diplomatic corps. And the board itself was founded in 1760. So it's 16 years older than the United States of America, who have, as you know, with Donald Trump, their 47th president. I'm the 49th president of the Board of Deputies. So it gives you a bit of a sense of the antiquity of the organization. And the way it's made up is of 200 member organizations from right across the UK, from Cornwall to Aberdeen. You represent the Leeds Jewish Representative Council. So synagogues and organizations right across the Jewish community. And we have 300 deputies, including yourself as an under 35, Shmuel, who are representing the community as a sort of Jewish parliament. And about every 6 weeks, the elected representatives of these organizations, these synagogues, come together and discuss the issues of the day. We have a great diversity of opinion, and we hear what the Jewish community thinks via their elected representatives. It's an amazing system, which means that the leadership of the Jewish community is connected at a grassroots level to all the different institutions we're seeking to represent. So that's how the board works. And in terms of becoming its president, so mine is a voluntary role. I was elected last year. Every 3 years, we have elections for our president and vice presidents and treasurer, who are elected and serve for 3 terms. We can serve a second period of 3 terms if we want to, and people want to re-elect us. That's their choice. But we also have a brilliant staff team, 15 brilliant staff who work for the organization in different parts of the country and on in areas of different expertise. So that's how the Board of Deputies works. That's how I came into my position.
Right. So as the president, something that I'd really want to point out as well, that I was really inspired by, is you recently met both Prime Minister Starmer and senior Conservative leaders. And in all the pictures, you were wearing your kippah quite proudly. Yet you're not a rabbi, or at least not yet. And yet you chose to display your Jewish identity to the highest officers in the UK as a leader of the highest Jewish representative organization in the country. So I guess there's 2 questions here that really I'd love to hear about. First is, how did you feel wearing your kippah so publicly in that scenario? And secondly, is what message can you give to young British Jews like us in the Jewish Stand who want to feel more proud to be Jewish in a country? And sometimes it feels like it's making it harder to do so.
I think the first thing to say is that, broadly speaking, I'm not sure I was even really conscious of it. I'm traditional. I wear a kippah sometimes, not all the time, but I do tend to wear it when I'm in a representative role for the community. I know not every Jewish person wears it, but that's just the way I feel. I'm from a traditional Orthodox background. It's just what feels most natural to me. And the way I'm received is really positively in those rooms. In some ways, I guess I stand out, that, people realize that here's someone who's chosen to wear something that identifies him in a particular way. But, I also sort of know some of these people a fair bit, so they're not sort of surprised or fazed to see me in that garb or guise. But I feel quite proud, I must say. I feel quite proud to represent the community, to be able to take a pride in a Jewish identity into these spaces, the highest levels of government, and for that to be not a curiosity or a barrier, but something that's seen as positive. That's one of the many that we have many challenges, but in this country, I think it's a really good thing that actually across all the political parties, you'll find that one is received really positively in those spaces, and identifying fully and overtly as a Jewish person.
Absolutely. I remember when I was on campus doing my activism, and I always wore my kippah, obviously, and people would always ask me, aren't you scared when all the anti-Semitism, especially after 7th of October, and you really do get a sense that people are getting more scared to wear their kippah, both in public, you hear it on the news, and also in the workplace and in universities. So, how do we respond to that, really? That fear, where we want to, proudly wear our Jewish identity?
I think people will, obviously, context is very important. People will know, when and where that it feels the most comfortable to do it. But I'd say as a general rule that people respect us when we respect ourselves. We've got nothing to be ashamed of. We've got a lot to be proud of. Doesn't mean we need to be kind of condescending or superior, but we're proud of who we are. And we engage with people with that sense of pride and confidence in who we are, and with respect for who they are if they're not part of our community. And I think that if you can model that, that's a good thing. And most people respond pretty well to that as a whole. So, there might be certain circumstances or situations where people are nervous and have reason to be nervous. I don't want to say people should be foolhardy, but and sometimes you'll see people wearing a cap if they might normally wear a kippah, they'll wear a cap over it or a hat. I hope there are relatively few instances people feel that the need to do that. But I think in a lot of settings, certainly that I'm in, people respond, either neutrally or positively. And if they respond negatively, that's on them.
Right. So definitely, I really agree with what you're saying, that when we get people respect us when we respect ourselves. And I guess that's an interesting segue to the next question. And getting right into it really is something a bit more controversial, perhaps. Our writer, Harry, was also an under 35 observer. He resigned from the board recently, and he wrote an article, and I'd highly recommend you read it if you haven't already. And he wrote there that one of the reasons why he resigned was what he called, at least this is my quote, is the board's failure to address the broader communal hesitancy and to confront uncomfortable truths and to prioritize Jewish safety and integrity over public image. And that's a very tough quote to hear, at least I'm sure it is. There are many different voices pulling the board one way or another, and on both the religious and political spectrum. In fact, some of my friends accuse the board of being too left and not pro-Israel enough. So, Phil, what do you feel the board's role is in an increasingly polarized community?
Well, first of all, I say I disagree with that characterization that Harry has put out. Obviously, he's entitled to his opinion, but if you look at the way that the board has been advocating, and I can particularly speak to the last year, since we came into office, we took on the issues of anti-Semitism and prejudice and have secured significant results. So you'll remember that a year or so ago, when we were elected, the major conversation was about these protests that have been happening, including outside our shuls and synagogues, particularly in places like central London. We worked with the police and government to push those away from synagogues. We worked with the government to change the law so that police would have the power to disperse or move away protests or not give permission for protests to take place outside shuls or other places of worship. And we worked on the prescription of Palestine Action who were proscribed. And actually, we have now, in many ways, changed the game on that issue. Of course, there are massive issues in civil society. And we recently launched a Commission on Anti-Semitism report that was led by Lord Mann and Penny Mordaunt, that has gone through sector by sector in civil society, talking about the changes we need to make. We've got lots of coverage about that. The Prime Minister said, Prime Minister's questions, that he would deal with those issues. He said it to me in person as well. And so we're going to be taking that forward. So I just dispute the idea that the board isn't campaigning vociferously and very effectively on those issues. We are. But you're right, Shmuel, of course, that there is a diversity of opinion in our community. People say that where there are 2 Jews, there are 3 opinions. And you can imagine with 300 deputies and 300,000 Jews, that's a lot of opinions to listen to. But I think the board, despite the fact that we're often the vector and the center of this debate, actually it's a huge privilege and there's an opportunity. First of all, who are these different tribes of Israel? And like I say, every person will have at least one opinion on almost every matter, sometimes multiple and sometimes conflicting opinions. But there are broadly 3 blocks of opinion on Israel specifically, because that's the thing that's most divisive. There's a group of people who say Israel right or wrong. It's our job to speak up for Israel. We don't have to necessarily agree with everything that it does. And if we don't agree, we shouldn't say anything. We don't need to praise everything. But, to the extent that we speak up, we should speak positively. That's one significant body of opinion. There's another group of people who say, and many of them are convinced and passionately committed Zionists, who say the current Israeli government is a disaster and it opposes the values that we have. And therefore, our role is to speak out against the Israeli government all the time. That's the way we as Jewish people and our Jewish values and Zionists need to speak out. And then there's this third group of people who kind of just want the shouting to stop and who want the family to get on. I often speak of these as the people who had a Friday night dinner when the more liberal niece is arguing with a more conservative uncle backwards and forwards, hammers and tongs, and someone will step in and say, would anyone like dessert? That's the kind of middle ground, and they want the family to stick together. And as much as I enjoy the arguments on all sides and hearing why that's the group I spend a lot of time thinking about and listening to. Where is that middle ground? What's that opinion? Where is the consensus? And what the board is able to do, perhaps more than any other place, is to hear those different perspectives and hear them with respect, and then say, well, what is the consensus? And as much as there are disagreements, there are many things, I think, on which we are as a community agreed. First of all, getting those hostages out. We must see the return of those hostages. I think all of us are, constantly have those hostages in our mind. Second of all, preventing Hamas from ever repeating the horrors of 7th October. We can't have our friends and neighbours, our loved ones in Israel, and indeed countries like our own in Britain, faced with this risk that these horrific terrorist atrocities will occur. So there needs to be an end to that, and we need to see that happen. We want to see aid into Gaza. We shouldn't see the Palestinian civilians paying the price for the actions of the crimes of Hamas. Of course, we don't want to see Hamas stealing that aid when it gets there. But it's very important we see massive and sustained aid. That's really important. And I think broadly and beyond that, we want to see lasting peace and security for Israelis, Palestinians, and the wider Middle East. This war is horrible. This conflict is horrible. And we don't want to see anyone killed or affected. We want to see people being able to live their full potential. And to the extent that we can, that's why we as a community want to try and do what we can to promote that peace and security for Israelis, Palestinians, the wider Middle East. We saw a few years ago those amazing Abraham Accords. Peace is possible. There are people who can do that to the extent that we can. And we know that we are, an island just off Europe. We're humble about the role that we have, but we have an important voice. We try and deploy it so that we push towards a better future for all in that region.
I really want to maybe touch on a bit more on that. When you say we do have a broad voice, we do have a big voice. So I know that one of the things that really matters is when we either speak out or speak for the Israeli government. A lot of people in Israel have very strong opinions on what the board does or what British Jews do. And, we do feel like we're all in this together. We're all in one big family, like you said, the 12 tribes. But sometimes it feels like, the one side saying that you're not speaking out enough. The other side saying you're not speaking out too much. And yet all of us feel really connected to Israel. So how do we balance that? Today as young British Jews, how can we have an opinion on Israel and care about it deeply, but also appreciate, we're not living there, but they do expect us, Israelis are expecting us as Jews to be involved with them, to have an opinion.
Yes, and I think that, Israel is a rambunctious democracy. So the expectations will differ from Israeli to Israeli, what that looks like, right? Just like all of the opinions I described are, even more so in Israel, people who expect unquestioning support for everything that Israel and its government does, people who think that our actions right now must be to support the protesters on the streets. Israel is a diverse, democratic country, and thank goodness for it. So I think that we are very blessed in this country, and the Zionists in this country, to have a very close and intimate relationship with Israel in a way that I think even the American Jewish community struggles. Essentially, it is relatively cheap, more expensive than we would like, but relatively cheap to go to Israel. And you can credibly go to Israel from the UK for a day or a long weekend, right? That's something that quite a lot of us do from time to time if we've got a simcha or whatever. So we, and I think particularly young Jewish people, have this kind of intimate relationship that's really not based on some sort of just grand theory, but the reality of the place. And so we see Israel, we see the amazing achievements firsthand. We see what an amazing country has been built despite all the challenges. We also see the challenges. And so I think that I think for young Jewish people, a connection, understanding, proper and real engagement is a good thing. People will come, as they do in terms of UK domestic politics, to different conclusions. But we want to hear that voice. We want to hear that real, passionate engagement, because the Zionist project, the project of Israel, is, it's an incredible blessing. We have to take a step backwards and pinch ourselves sometimes. For thousands of years, our ancestors yearned for a return. They yearned for a state to call their own. Now the question is about how that state operates within the incredible challenges it has. And, I don't think it's a problem to have multiple inputs. Let's find the best knowledge on that. Let's work out how Israel achieves all the amazing things that it has as potential, how it achieves what we see in its Declaration of Independence, which speaks about a state at peace with its neighbors, at peace with itself. Israel is not in that place at the moment. What can we do to help it get there?
I think you definitely see that also again on campus, when a lot of the interactions we had was explaining, I used to like to say to people, my great grandfather was a Palestinian. He was born there, he lived there all his life, and back then it was called the British Mandate of Palestine. And it really gives an understanding that, when you see British Jewish students or, regular people in the streets, Jewish people, most of them have very deep connections to Israel, not just to their Jewish, but it's also to the state of Israel, to the concept. And it makes sense that would have such strong opinions, either for or against the government, whichever one, but we all strongly do believe in Israel. And I guess maybe something that I also love to ask you about next is, we also know that the British government is sometimes comes out with comments that we would disagree with. So where does our role come in as British Jews here in the UK? Like, where do we balance, or how can we balance as young British Jews, being in Britain, living here, this is our country, but also having that strong connection to Israel? And when, sometimes it's a bit difficult to reconcile that connection, especially with a government that might be coming up with statements which we might not agree with.
I think it's a very good question. For much of my life, I've been blessed with a situation where the UK and Israel, might have had sometimes disagreements, and that was painful, but it was the exception rather than the norm. We're seeing that more and more now, and that's really hard. We don't want to see the UK and Israel fighting. It's like watching two family members fight sometimes for us, and we, I think, have a role and opportunity to try and play a bridge, help British people understand Israel's perspective, but also Israelis to understand the British perspective, and to try and bring as much positivity as possible to that relationship. How people will respond to that will, to go back to our previous point, will respond probably quite a lot to how they feel about the current situation, which, as we know, people feel different things about, and that's, highly legitimate, and we need to find ways to my role is to find the consensus points, but people will take different views on it. But I think we start by seeing the real positives to both of those connections. The brilliant, the amazing history of Jews in this country, and the amazing contribution that we have made and continue to make to this country. And the fact that the UK has in many ways been a very good place for Jews historically and relatively and in all ways. And that Israel is Reshit Tzmichat Gulatenu. It's just this amazing thing that in the context of thousands of years of dispersal and hatred, there is now a Jewish state, and that's a very precious and wonderful thing, with many things and facets that are to be proud of. Admittedly, also big challenges that any country had the challenges they had would be in real difficulties right now. So I think we have a unique ability to try and understand both, see the amazing achievements of both, see the challenges of both, call it as we see it. We've been very critical, for example, in the last week or so of the UK's decision to recognise a Palestinian state without placing, without placing conditions on Hamas in terms of releasing the hostages or engaging in good faith in ceasefire negotiations. We call that out. And that's not out of any sort of sense of negativity towards the UK. We love the UK. But actually, we think the UK is taking in this position, in this situation, positions that are against the UK's own interests. The UK wants to see an end to this conflict, wants to see the hostages out. So it's actually disincentive. It's created the false incentives that mean Hamas have no incentive to agree a ceasefire, release the hostages. So we give that advice to the UK government. We say, this is a wrong decision. We think you should rethink this. But that's because we want our country to succeed. We want to see Israel flourish and succeed. So that is, it comes out of a good place, even when we feel we have to be critical.
That's a really good outlook, I think, of how we as young Jews, or British Jews also, try to reconcile our identity with being British and also having that strong connection to Israel. So maybe I'd also love to touch on a bit more about then, we talked about us within ourselves, talk about us within and the British government. What about us and the British community? It's changing. We're seeing much different societal changes than we used to since we were growing up and since even before we were born. And maybe this is also a good point to talk about your interfaith work that you've been doing a lot. So how do you see today, our standing as Jews in the British community?
I think we're broadly very well received. I know that we focus a lot, and we're right to focus on the challenges, but actually surveys of British opinion reveal a relatively positive disposal towards Jewish people in this country. And I think that's important to remember. It's been historically the case and should continue. I do think we're at something of an inflection point, because there is this rising populism, rising extremism in some quarters. And the kind of risk that is to our society has been seen in different ways, particularly over the last 22 months or so, but, at particular moments. So last summer, in summer of 2024, we saw those riots across the country, where we saw far-right thugs and Islamist extremists throwing bricks and Molotov cocktails at one another and catching decent people from all communities in the middle. And we know that we as a community are at the center, really, of all these extremist groups, whether the far right, the far left, Islamist extremists. None of them seem to like us much, but all of them are a problem for society as a whole. They pull society apart and they undermine it. And in the worst cases, you see these moments of violence. So I think we and society are at an inflection point, and we need to deal with this. We need to grip it. I spend a lot of time telling government ministers that this cannot be in the too difficult box. And we, I think, as a Jewish community, with our historic recognition of these problems for what they are, but also our ability to reach out, have an opportunity to try and strengthen the moderate middle. So one of the things that I'm really, really interested in is working with friends and neighbors from the Muslim community who share our concern about extremism from all sides, who oppose anti-Semitism, just as we need to oppose anti-Muslim hatred, who want to work with us. Just today, we've seen a member of parliament call for halal and shechita to be banned, both halal and kosher. So we sometimes our communities are pushed into positions where actually we're defending the same point. So we look to build that. I launched, after I was elected, what I call the Optimistic Alliance, because I've been active in interfaith for some 20 years. And when I was elected, 30 or 40 Muslim leaders wrote to me and said, let's work together. And so I wrote back to them. I said, that's wonderful. Come in and see us. And I thought maybe 3 or 4 would come, times being what they are. But 30 of them came. Sunni, Shia, more conservative, more liberal voices in the Muslim community. And we launched what we call the Optimistic Alliance, where we're going to work together on these shared challenges, tackling racism, tackling extremism, finding ways to discuss the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The late Chief Rabbi Lord Sachs said we shouldn't import conflict, we should export peace instead. Is there a way we can do that? It's worth exploring. Defending shared religious values. I took a joint Muslim-Jewish delegation to meet the health minister around getting the bodies of our loved ones released quickly for burial, because both of our communities require that, and sometimes we don't get it. So, and I've been asked to set up another similar delegation with Muslim leaders. They've asked us to help with that. How can we work together in the education sphere? So there are the possibility of doing these things and working with good people from all sectors of society to say, look, if we become a society of extremists who kind of just a constant pitched battle with one another, this country will fall apart, and it will be unlivable for everyone. It'll be unlivable for us, but it'll be unlivable for everyone. So let's try and find something better, find a better way to go about it. And, we are seeing the signs of success, not just in aspiration. But, when I spoke earlier about how we'd work with government to change the law on protecting places of worship, we didn't make that argument for our community alone. We said, look, we believe this is in the interests of both Muslim and Jewish communities. And I took this point directly to the Home Secretary. Before we went to see the Home Secretary, I started speaking to Muslim friends and partners about this. And I said, look, there are these demonstrations that are right outside our synagogues. I would like to move forward a legislative change that would say that those demonstrations should not be allowed just outside our synagogues. Not so that they shouldn't be allowed to happen, there's free speech, but not, we should have a distance. The first response is, why? This is just an impingement on free speech. I said, do you want a society in which far-right demonstrators are outside mosques? They said, fair point. I said, look, we're not saying that nobody should be allowed to express their views. People should have free speech. But why don't we say that what we're going to create is views about what is civically responsible? So you can have your demonstration, but don't have it right outside where someone's place of worship is. And the Muslim colleagues were like, yeah. And in fact, we had this declaration called the Drumlanrig Accords, where both Muslim and Jewish leaders across the piece, the whole spectrum of Jewish and Muslim leaders, agreed that we should be protecting each other's places of worship. So I took this to the government and I said, look, we agree. This is not just about protecting our communities, although that's really important. It's also about protecting other communities. And it's about finding those things across the whole piece that say, how do we work together? How do we maintain a civil means of discourse in this community, in this society, that accepts that there'll be differences, strong differences of opinion, but say there are ground rules. There are ground rules that protect all of us together, either the law or just the way we go about it. That's the way we can forge forward together.
I think that's really inspiring, because we spoke about the past, so the Board of Deputies and how it's started, and then we came to the present, and you gave a really optimistic picture of how we can really work together, with the government and also within our community and also with other communities. So I guess maybe it's a good opportunity to move on then, as we always do, to the future. And so my last question is, what do you hope for in the future of British Jewry, and for the future specifically of young Jews who are increasingly proud of their connection to Israel?
So, I feel, and I have the great privilege of traveling the whole country and meeting the most conservative Orthodox communities and the most liberal progressive communities. And what is common across all is there's a lot of anxiety. Being Jewish feels to a lot of people quite heavy at the moment, whether it's about anti-Semitism or the war or the fear about the hostages or the Holocaust being very central to the frame of our identity. And all of those things are important, and we must take positive steps to advocate for the things that matter to us. But we're not just about those negative things. I'm really struck by the fact that the only public commemoration of Jewish life at the moment in this country is Holocaust Memorial Day, and the only compulsory education is Holocaust education, both of which are incredibly important. But it can't be that the average British person just knows that there were dead Jews in Europe. We want them to know that there are Jews living in this country, contributing to our society, our economy, and our culture. And so we are going to be, next year for the first time, launching a Jewish Culture Month, a British Jewish Culture Month for the first time in the month of Sivan, so that it begins with Shavuot and that celebration of our faith and how that all connects together. and we share cheesecake with our friends and neighbours of different faiths as well. And then have a whole celebration of everything that there is that we as a community have. Our amazing buildings and heritage, our history, our literature, our comedy, our food, our music, contribution across all parts of society. And I think this is really important because I don't want just that we see ourselves and are seen by others as through the vector of Jewish pain. I want also Jewish joy. And so I talk about the real importance of how we move as a community, and this being a movement of a strategic rebrand, if you like, from less oi to more joy. And that's really what I think is essential for us at the moment. We have so much going for us. There are so many positives historically and contemporaneously. Let's celebrate that as well. Not to ignore the challenges. Yes, we need to confront them, but we also need to see those positives. And when I go around the country and I speak to young members of our community, and we first met on one of my visits to Leeds, and visiting university campuses and seeing both the challenges there, but the amazing resilience. And here I want to pay some tribute to you. I thought the table initiative was just an incredible response, such a positive response for the challenges we face. Confront all of this hateful comment and rhetoric with pride in who we are, with the ability to share a falafel and share some stories about what's happening and give people some real context as to who we are. I believe that I just love the UK Jewish community, which is probably a good qualification to do what I do. And you have to ask me in 3 years whether I still do. But I believe that if we invite people in to see us, they will love us too. And I think that's something that the table really showed as an initiative. Reach out, be positive. It gave me and gives me a lot of hope in the future of our community. I think you see, and I've heard that on university campuses, our friends at the Union of Jewish Students say that more people are doing more Jewish things on campus, admittedly under more security, but actually there's a real sense of connection, and we should grab that and celebrate it and bring together all of the joy that there is. If we can play our part of that through this Jewish Culture Month, that's important. But I know so many of our young Jewish people are coming up with initiatives like this one, like this podcast, may I say as well, and thinking positive into the future. And I think that gives us a lot of hope.
Phil, thank you so much for your kind words. And again, thank you so much for your time today. This has been an absolute honor to interview. Make sure to subscribe and like our podcast and our interviews to see more of stuff like this, and especially to hear more inspiring words. Hopefully we'll have you again in the future. Phil, thank you so much for joining us today.
A pleasure. Thank you, Shmuel.